This episode is brought to you by Bound Hat Company. Discover Bound Hat Company, where high-quality hats meet a greater purpose. Each hat is designed not only for style, but also to give back, with proceeds supporting charities like the PTSD Foundation of America. Whether for the outdoors or everyday wear, Bound Hat Company has the perfect hat for any occasion. Shop now at www.boundhatco.com and join the movement to support veterans and meaningful causes. Bound Hat Co. Style that makes a difference.
The following podcast discusses sensitive topics. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling, call or text 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline for 24/7 confidential support.
Welcome to Survival in the Trenches, Life Beyond Loss, a podcast where we share the powerful stories of those who have faced extraordinary loss and found the strength to push forward and triumph. These are real journeys of resilience, courage, and hope. Join us as we uncover what it means to rise above, even in the darkest of times. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Survival in the Trenches. My name is Kelly Chandler. I will be your host. Today, we are honored to sit down with Sara Joern, who is joining us to discuss her life after loss and how she's turning tragedy into purpose. Today, we will focus on her story of her sister who lost her life, unfortunately, due to suicide, and how she's moving through as a therapist specializing in EMDR therapy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are excited to learn more about you as an individual before we dive into all of the things that you're doing to help others that have experienced loss. If you don't mind sharing with our listeners where you grew up, what your aspirations were as a young child, and we can kind of go from there.
All right. So I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, born and raised. I wanted to be a marine biologist or a veterinarian, which in hindsight, I'm realizing I really just wanted to hang out with animals all day. I didn't want to do the sciencey stuff or have to do surgery on a dog that came in with like a broken leg from being hit by a car. I didn't realize that until much later. If you had told my 15-year-old self I would have been a therapist, I would have thought that you were crazy. But eventually, I always loved studying psychology. And so when I was in undergrad, started pre-med for the whole veterinary thing. And after like 3 weeks of organic chemistry and kind of realizing that I was too empathetic towards animals to actually be an effective veterinarian, I started looking at like the psychology route. And that's sort of what led me to the counseling field.
Awesome. So did you grow up with animals? Like, what was your affinity toward that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we always had dogs and cats growing up, at least 2 of each at any given time, sometimes 3. My mom was a big animal lover. My dad was one of those reluctant animal lovers, like, I don't want another one. And then he's on the floor snuggling the dog, like when we're going to bed. And then I think a lot of outdoor time, like, you know, playing in the creek, looking for box turtles, having sort of that wonder and awe of nature, and my mom really fostering that in us. So it was, yeah, a love for wild and domestic animals.
That's sweet. And so you felt a connection with animals and nature kind of all wrapped in one.
Yeah, which kind of led to my undergraduate degree is in eco-psychology, which is kind of a mix of environmental studies and psychology and kind of looking at our relationship with nature as part of the healing process, and that our disconnection from nature as part of like a contributor to the mental health struggles that people have today.
That's interesting. Excuse me, that's interesting. It's something that seems very natural. I know we're using the word nature, but I feel like there is that almost ethereal, I don't know what the right word is. It's just it's more of an intrinsic vantage point where you feel like when you're in nature, you can connect at a deeper level. And it's interesting that you traversed into that after realizing that you didn't want to deal with the sciencey part, as you call it. So as you progress through that change, when did you realize that you were going to get into therapy for people?
So studying psychology, that's kind of, those are your options, right? Like you can be a counselor / therapist, or like go into research, or get that as your bachelor's and get a master's in something completely different. But I always knew whatever I was going to do that I wanted to help people or beings, right? Like veterinarian, helping animals, therapist, helping people. And started realizing like I love psychology. People tell me that I'm a really good listener. Like I like showing up for people. I had various therapists, like when I was in elementary school and my parents got divorced, very bad experience with a therapist. Had a therapist in high school when I was dealing with my own anxiety, depression, being a teenager and not really being taught how to be in the world as a highly sensitive, empathic, emotional being. And that therapist did a lot for me. And so kind of looking at what my options were, and I was like, I think the counseling route might be what I want to do. And then found a graduate school that had a wilderness therapy degree. And I was like, yes, that's it.
I've never heard of that in my entire life. Where did you get this degree?
So the undergrad I went to was a non-traditional school. The graduate school was also non-traditional. It's called Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. So it was founded by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was like, I know it's a mouthful. He was, I believe, the leader or the founder of the Shambhala lineage. But it's a Buddhist-inspired contemplative education. So a lot of emphasis on mindfulness and how that helps you as a therapist, like maintaining your seat, being grounded, tracking your own internal experience while you're tracking what's happening with the client. And then also just doing a lot of your own inner work. So that, because they say you can only take your clients as deep as you yourself have gone. So having us go really deep and doing our own work as the wounded healer, they liked to call it.
Very interesting. So how old were you during all of this?
So I went straight to grad school from undergrad, which was, it was right after the 2008 recession. So I was like, I'm not entering the workforce. This is a good time to get a degree. So I was, and I'm old for my grade, 22 or 23 when I started grad school, and it was a 3-year program. So I was 25 or 26 when I graduated. So very young. There was a lot of work to do.
So tell me a little bit more about your childhood and how things progressed as you were getting older and what home life was like for you.
Yeah, so I was the oldest. My sister was born when I was 2. Parents were married, kind of typical nuclear family, and then they got divorced when I was in 5th grade. My dad had been closeted gay, and my mom found out what his sexual orientation was and ended up leaving him. So that was very discombobulating, right? It was, at that age, 10, 11, it's like, oh, divorce is something that happens to other people. Was never really on my radar. So parents separated, so then grew up in 2 different households. It's funny because when it first happened, my sister very much sort of took my mom's side and I took my dad's side. We didn't know why they were getting divorced at the time. And then those roles very much reversed later on, where my sister and my dad had a very, very close relationship, and then me and my mom were closer. And yeah, in terms of what kind of kid I was very much the teacher's pet, like president of student council, all of that in elementary school and junior high. And then high school started kind of rebelling. Typical teenager, but I worked really hard and I played really hard. So I was the straight A student who partied a lot. And then my sister, who was 2 years younger, had kind of come to all of that around the same time, which again, in hindsight, is partially due to her trauma that she experienced in 8th grade, the first time. And I think both of us were self-medicating with substances, socializing, that type of thing at the time. I didn't realize that that's what I was doing, but as an adult, I can see that.
Sure. Wow. So you're dealing with two huge changes. So one is divorce, which is traumatic in and of itself, especially at a younger age where it's hard to probably explain that discourse or what have you. And then you're also dealing with your dad coming out saying he is gay. I mean, how did you manage those two different things going on, both of you, your sister and yourself?
Yeah, and I don't really know. I mean, I think I just like threw myself into school even more. I'm glad I had my sister because her and I could talk about things. And we were raised very liberal, very progressive, you know, like I didn't have anything against people being gay. I was always the kid who somebody would like make a gay joke or be like, that's so gay. And I'm like, why are you saying that? Before I even knew. But there was still this thing around, you know, I grew up in a pretty conservative area. It was very like mainstream, and just didn't know a lot of people who were queer, if any. And so as I came to learn that that was why, like I started putting two and two together. So my dad didn't come out to us officially until I was a sophomore in high school. And that was after them getting divorced in 5th grade.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, and then I was like trying to protect my sister from it. Again, protect her from what? I don't know exactly. But yeah, it was just kind of trying to, I don't know. I don't know if I was consciously trying to accept it, but it was just like, it is what it is.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to focus on being a teenager.
Which is, I mean, that's typically at that age, that's all you're worried about anyway. But I mean, you've got a lot of extraneous things going on and trying to manage different scenarios. So you're saying you were in 5th grade when they got divorced and you didn't even know, or it wasn't officially
like explicit.
Right. Until you were, that's a big amount of time. And then it's interesting that you're like, okay, that makes sense. Or in your own mind, that made sense. How was your sister doing through all of this during those years?
Pretty okay, I think. You know, she came to me at one point and was like, do you think Dad's gay? And I was, in my head, I'm like, yes. And out loud, I was like, no. But again, we were kind of like different how we were aligned with our parents, which I think caused some tension. And then as we got older, like in high school, and she started acting out, and she got caught a lot more than I did. And my dad was very hands-off. So then he was wanting me to parent her. And I was like, I'm 17 years old. This is not my job. You chose to have children. Like, I'm not going to decide what her punishment should be. I'm not going to stay home on a Friday night because you grounded her, like, because you want to go out with your friends. So that caused some tension between me and my sister and me and my dad. So that kind of complicated things a little bit.
Absolutely.
In high school, me and my sister were not close, to say the least.
Interesting. So tell me about your sister. Tell me a little bit about her life. I wouldn't say as compared to you, but it sounds like you were maybe on different paths or, you know, took things a little bit differently and she approached things in her own way. Let's talk about her for a little bit.
Yeah. So I was the straight A kid over here, and she was the like outgoing, gregarious, like did theater. I think for her 9th or 10th birthday, she wrote an entire script, designed all the costumes, and directed and starred in a play. And that was her birthday party. Was
Wow.
like, yeah, that's kind of her in a nutshell. So she was very creative, loved being in the spotlight. And it was just like a really bright, hilarious little kid and adult.
That's incredible. So she was very motivated in her creativity, it sounds like. And so when did things change for her where things started getting a little bit more complicated?
That was in 8th grade. She was sexually assaulted by one of her quote-unquote friends. And that was definitely a turning point. That was like a big trauma. She withdrew after that, kind of didn't want to be in the spotlight as much, understandably. now I know that that's a reaction to the trauma. But yeah, you could see the change.
So she was sexually assaulted in 8th grade, so 13 years oldish. And how did she come back to the family and share that information? How did you become aware of it, and how did you all react and help support her?
Yeah. So she had been seeing a therapist, and so she had called us into her therapist's office, and her therapist was like, Emily has something she wants to share with you guys. So Emily brought us into her therapist's office and told us that she had been raped, and I did not want to believe it. I was in denial, so I told her that I didn't believe it, and I regret that to this day. Her and I talked about it later as adults, but having worked on a sexual assault crisis line and working with survivors of assault and intimate partner violence, it's like the number one thing you do is believe people, right? And I didn't do that one thing. And so that's where I feel like I don't want to say failed her, but I wish if I could go back and do that differently, I would.
And how did your parents react?
My dad was also in denial. I think it was pretty hard on my mom. They didn't really know what to do, and I don't remember a lot of the specifics. I know my dad was like, well, what do we do? And asked the therapist, and the therapist was like, well, buy her all these things and let her do whatever she wants. And it was, not great advice, because teens want boundaries, because boundaries mean you love me. And all the boundaries just kind of went out the window.
Wow. So the reaction from the therapist was to just buy her happiness to get her to like avoid facing it, kind of a thing?
I don't know. I mean, that's now that I'm a therapist, like knowing there are good therapists out there and there are not so great therapists out there. And this was one that I think was in the not so great category.
And so when everyone was aware of the situation and she had some support-ish, and maybe more from the mom, your mom, I mean, versus maybe you and your dad, just accepting that this was true and it was a reality. Is that kind of where it sat for a little bit?
I don't know. I think so. And then it was further complicated because the guy who assaulted her died in a car crash, in a drunk driving car crash a few years later. So his face was plastered all over the school. And so that was like re-traumatizing and triggering for my sister. And that's when she came out and told a bunch of her friends. And her friends didn't believe her either. And it was like, don't speak ill of the dead. And,
oh boy.
You know, she went to the school counselor, and the school counselor was like, you're not the only girl who's come forward to tell me that this is an option, or this was an issue, but there's nothing I can do. Like, I want to support these other people in their grief, but then this is impacting the people that he assaulted negatively too. So I think that brought it all back up to the surface. That would have been, I can't remember. No, I was home from college. So that would have been her junior year of high school. So like 3 years later. So she was raped, according to her, in 8th grade. Yeah.
And then this person went on to die in a drunk driving accident and was basically grieved, memorialized, what have you, through school. And especially at those younger ages, it's like so shocking when people pass away. So I've been through that, you know, personally in high school, and everyone's so focused on that. But yet she's like, no, this, of course, no one wants anyone to die in a drunk driving accident. But she's thinking, this person basically changed the entire trajectory of my life and thinking, and he's being honored over here.
Yeah.
And she's probably, as you've stated, going through all that trauma all over again, but even worse because it's just constantly in her face.
Yep.
So how was she acting? Like, how was she behaving and trying to move forward through all that?
And I was in college at this point, so I don't know a ton, but what I do know, I mean, she was using a lot of substances. She had been partying a lot, and she had gotten into cocaine. And then one day, she was at her dealer's house, this is my understanding, and he ended up giving her heroin instead, and then she was hooked.
Oh, no.
And so then she was using heroin a lot because it was an escape. And so she actually ended up doing her senior year of high school at a wilderness therapy rehab to get off of the heroin.
Wow.
Which was it was not a great program. I mean, I think the intention was good, or when it was founded, it was good, but there were a lot of things about the program itself that were re-traumatizing too, which is not great. I mean, she got clean, but she held a lot of scars from that emotionally as well.
So then following her treatment, what happened? How did she reintegrate, and did she show signs of progression after that? I know you said it wasn't a great program, but did you feel like she was on the up and up, if you will, like she was getting better?
There were parts of it. So she had there was like a pre-program before the actual program, and there she really connected with a therapist that she liked a lot, that she stayed in touch with, I think, for years afterwards. And she started to kind of heal. But that was part of the issue. There wasn't a reintegration, right? So she graduated this wilderness therapy program and then went straight to college at CU Boulder, which is has a reputation for being a party school. So then she just kind of fell back into it. And it was I think whether she's said this explicitly or not, it was kind of well, as long as I'm not doing heroin, it's fine. And so she went there for a year, ended up dropping out, but stayed in Boulder and just kind of kept partying. I don't even know if she was working. My dad was still paying for her apartment and stuff. And then I'm not clear on the timeline of everything. I think she got a DUI and then came back to St. Louis to work for a year or two, get through the DUI, save money, that type of thing, and then eventually ended up moving back out to Boulder and then ultimately Denver. So it was she was fits and starts of healing. She would go to therapy and then not. I was trying to get her, after I got my graduate degree in counseling and was more immersed in the mental health world, I really wanted her to do EMDR. And she would be yeah, I'm going to do EMDR. And she was going to set up a consultation with somebody. And then the next day she'd be no, I don't need it. So a lot of us, there's on the good days you feel good, you don't think you need it. And there's an understandable fear and avoidance to facing our demons, even if they're eating us alive from the inside out.
Wow. So do you think her struggles stemmed as far back as when you all were little and you went through the divorce period? Or do you think it was more of the 8th grade experience that she went through, or a combination? I mean, it's hard to probably pinpoint, or does it build? I mean, how do you assess that as someone that's a therapist?
Yeah. I don't know. But I think if I'm thinking about just objective facts, right, and observing her, that we were both relatively okay after the divorce. Divorces are hard and kids are so much more resilient than we give them credit for. Adults are too. But being able to see the marked difference with the sexual assault in 8th grade, to me, that seems more of the turning point.
Sure. Which is understandable. It's a direct experience versus something on the periphery. So that makes sense to me. And it sounds like she did some different things, but then, hey, I'm okay, I'm not okay. Like you said, good days and bad days. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it was hard for you, having your background, being a therapist, exploring the mental health field and trying to help your sister.
Yeah.
So where are we now in the story? How was she doing, and what was the next phase for you guys at that point?
Yeah. So she was back in school getting her art history degree. She wanted to eventually be a museum curator. And her and I ended up moving in together in Denver. And we lived together for was it a year and a half? And she had just started partying a lot again. She was very into the music scene in Denver, which I get. I think with my own experience with live music and everything now, and community and all of that, I think that the impulse towards that was really healthy in a lot of ways, and the way that like music can be healing, like there's music therapy, all of that. But the way that crowd kind of went about attending concerts and what they did at concerts and all of that wasn't great. And so with the level that she was partying and everything, it ended up being kind of dangerous. You know, she would come home and leave all the doors unlocked or open, and we had pets, and it wasn't a good environment. And that was where I had to work through a lot of like wanting to save her and realizing that like I couldn't, and that boundaries are love, actually. That it's not the opposite. It's not like I don't care about you. And so doing the boundaries, making boundaries for her sake, but for my sake too. And sometimes we have to love somebody from afar. It's like the distance that maximizes the love. So that was another kind of big turning point. And she had come over after she moved out one day to use the internet, and we ended up getting in an argument, and she left and had been drinking and got a DUI. And then that was kind of a downward trajectory of, it's a long story, but the judge had lost her son to a drunk driver, the judge that oversaw DUI court in this county in Colorado. And so kind of had it out for everybody. So she just like threw the book at anyone and everyone. And my sister ended up going to jail for 7 months for violating her probation for like a completely BS reason. And I don't know what all happened in there or what was going on. She also was dating a guy who was not healthy at the time. He has since also taken his own life. But so she got out of jail in July of 2019 and then killed herself in October of 2019. So yeah, and her and I were loosely in communication at that point. Like I wrote her when she was in jail. I had seen her once in person, and we would text every now and then. But I don't know a lot of what was going on with her at that point, since we weren't really in that much contact.
I'm very sorry to hear that. Obviously, our condolences for your loss, and I'm sure your mind at the time was lost in the sense of you didn't kind of know where she was or what she was doing. It sounds like there was a lot of space there. What about your parents? Were they involved? Were they trying to help her during this phase?
Yeah. I mean, they did video calls with her. My mom was trying to get her into therapy, like consistent therapy, for a long time. I think she was required to go to therapy as part of probation, but I know my mom asked her at one point, like, well, so have you worked through some of the trauma? Because after the sexual assault in 8th grade, she was assaulted at least 2 other times as a teen and or adult. It might be more than, it might be 3. But when she asked Emily about it, when my mom asked Emily, have you worked through some of that stuff? She was like, I don't talk about that in therapy. And so, yeah, it was still the unresolved trauma.
So she was going to therapy, but just for stuff that obviously was on the periphery. It wasn't the root cause of things that were probably getting to her mentally.
Yeah.
It sounds like. And from the time she got out of jail to the time that she took her life, were there signs that you thought this was going to happen, or was that ever a threat in your mind?
Like yes and no. I mean, she had attempted suicide for the first time, I think shortly after the assault in 8th grade, and had a few attempts at least that seemed like cries for help, very much so. And, you know, she would go to treatment. She was still seeing the therapist, who wasn't that great at that point. And there were times that she would like threaten suicide or say that she just wanted it all to end. And so, I mean, it's like it wasn't a complete surprise, and it also was, because she had such a bright personality. Like, you know, we're all complex, multifaceted humans, right? But like everybody who met Emily was like, it's like all the cliches, right? She lights up her room. Everyone was always excited to see her. She had so much love to give, and she gave so much love to everybody else and had a really hard time giving it back to herself.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think it's easier to project it sometimes than it is to be more introspective with some of that.
Yeah.
So how did you find out when this happened?
Yeah, I had just gotten back from like a whirlwind wedding season. I had been in California for a wedding, and then stayed longer to visit with a friend, came back, had gotten sick, and it was a Wednesday, I believe. So I had gotten back on Monday, and no, it was a weekend. Sorry, that part doesn't matter. I woke up to a call from my mom, and she was crying, and she said, Emily's dead. And I had just woken up. So it's one of those things where, I think even if you've been awake for hours, it's like your brain's trying to compute. It's like, wait, what's happening? And then my dad got on the phone, and I think there were police in the background. Like, I don't remember what all was said, but it's one of those that's burned in my mind, right? I can see myself sitting up in my bed. I can see my bedroom. I was supposed to like be moving a couch into my new office. So I started my private practice right around when she killed herself. But I had two friends who were going to help me move furniture, two friends who happened to have lost siblings as well. And so I told them what happened, and of course they came over. And I was in shock, like even being a mental health professional, I was like, well, because this was a Saturday. I was like, I'm going to go to work on Monday. I'll check in on my parents, like da da da. And one of my dear friends who I had known since college, she was like, no, we're going to look at flights. You're going to go home. You need to be with your parents. You're not going to work on Monday. You're going to call work and tell them you're taking bereavement leave. I was like, okay. So yeah, I went home, was home with my parents for a week, came back to Denver. Again, thought I was going to go back to work, didn't, took another week off. But you're just in a fog, right? Like it hasn't settled in. And I was trying to show up for my parents, and they told me, they were like, you were our rock. You did so much. And then I hit a breaking point, and I was like, I need to grieve. Like, I know this was your daughter, and I can't imagine what you're going through. And this was my sister. Like, I need to go do my thing. And my therapist was on maternity leave, of course. So I, contacted her. She got me in touch with a grief counselor. But yeah, it was such a whirlwind. And then starting my own business on the side. Like the juxtaposition was so interesting. And it was, in a way, like I didn't throw myself into it in terms of like, I'm just going to repress everything that's happening. And it was something else for me to focus on, which was helpful.
Absolutely. I think so many people have to have something to focus on, like you said, to grasp at while they're trying to process all the emotions that were thrust upon them. You weren't expecting that. You might have had some inklings of problems, but you certainly didn't expect it to probably escalate to that level.
Yeah.
And it is a blessing that your friends were there to help encourage you to take time for yourself, to leave, as much as your brain was like, no, I have to get my affairs in order. I need to focus on my job and that type of thing, your private practice. I think that was extremely beneficial for you to go back and spend time with your family and take time for yourself. I know exactly what you mean, though, because I feel like sometimes I can put all my emotions over here and like you just focus. It's like when someone gets injured or something, you just take care of it.
Yeah.
And then you go over there and you're like, wow, did that really just happen?
Yep.
It's like two pieces of your brain kind of a thing.
You're in crisis mode.
Yes.
And then it's not until you stop
Right.
that it comes flooding in. And then we all stopped in a big way because then the pandemic hit 5 months later.
Boy.
So, yeah. Interesting timing.
Yeah, and the juxtaposition between you being a therapist trying to help others and then you're dealing with all this mental trauma, if you will, on your own. So how do you balance that and be there for people, you know, to help them through these problems? So that's you're dealt with two different conflicting things going on there. So
Yeah.
it's a tall order. And then you throw the pandemic on top of that. Wow. So you got back into your world, so to speak, after you had a week with your family, you had some time to yourself, and then you started working again. And how was that when you first started getting back into like more of a routine?
It was tough. So my day job was at a community mental health agency. And then I was doing private practice, like evenings, and I had every other Friday off. So I was like building my caseload. And interestingly, I had just put in my notice for my day job, I think like a week or two before my sister died. And so I had given them 2 months notice because I wanted them to be able to hire somebody else. I didn't want my clients to be left high and dry. I wanted to terminate with people. And I had colleagues who were like, if you just left, nobody would blame you. Like, quit tomorrow. And I was like, my relationships with my clients mean a lot to me. I want to do this right. And so the days that I worked the day job and then did private practice in the evenings were very long days. And then I had adopted my sister's dog. So I was going home at lunch to take her out. She was diagnosed with cancer right after, died a month and 3 days after my sister died. And one of those things, like they were so bonded, like they were meant to be together. But that was another grief and trauma on top of everything else. So yeah, it was tough. And I had people who really showed up for me. I mean, even my therapist who was on maternity leave, like when it first happened, spent close to an hour on the phone with me, which she did not have to do. Again, got me connected with a grief counselor. And I saw my community show up in a way that I didn't realize, like how I don't know how to say it, like how loved I was, how supported I was. And it sucks to have to go through something like this to realize that. But I just have like deep wells of gratitude for family, friends, coworkers, like people who really, really showed up, checked in on me. That's what helped me get through it.
Absolutely. Community, just feeling that sense of you're being wrapped around something. You know, your arms or someone's wrapping their arms around you, taking care of you, and it sounds like you had that from multiple angles, personally and professionally. So yeah, that's awesome. Now, how did EMDR come into play for you, and how did you get into this practice? Did you do it yourself and then like as part of your therapy, and that's how you got into this and translated it into your profession?
So yes, the therapist that I saw in high school did a version of EMDR with me. In hindsight, it didn't work exactly the way it was supposed to. I think because she was doing the protocol a little bit different, and I don't think we had identified the correct targets. And that's something I can get in a little bit more later. But having the right target of what you're actually processing can be really important, because sometimes you're on like the superficial layer and we want to get to the core of it. So I had experienced it, but it hadn't been super effective for me. But I didn't know that that's, like, I don't think she ever used the words EMDR. I'm not sure. But then when I was in graduate school, EMDR was like all the rage, right? That's what people wanted to get trained in. Because it was this like it started in the 90s, but evidence-based practice. So meaning it's backed up with a lot of research. And I wanted to get EMDR trained, but working for a nonprofit in community mental health didn't have a lot of time or money to do that. And then they ended up, it was like, I worked at the nonprofit for 6 years. And so I think it was about 4 years into it, they were going to offer the training through that agency. So I jumped on it. I applied. You had to be, approved by your supervisor and yada, yada. But so they trained me. And then I also got the certification. Some people do the training and don't go on to be certified, which is just another level. It's, you have to have supervision, do a certain amount of sessions, consultations, that type of thing. But, I've always wanted to work with trauma, which is very broad, right? That can mean all sorts of things. So assault, car accidents, veterans, childhood trauma, what we call the little T traumas that build up over time, right? It's not this single big incident, but, emotional abuse or neglect as a kid. These things that happen in childhood that shape us in adulthood. And then EMDR was this tool to get at the root of all of it. And so I started the EMDR training in, I think it was July of 2017 or sometime in 2017. Mm-hmm.
So for those who are listening, explain first of all, what it means and what it's all about. I had never heard about EMDR until a couple of women who we've interviewed mentioned it as being very beneficial for them. So we started researching it more, and it's very interesting. So if you could just give more of the background, what it stands for, and let us know, how it's been a part of your journey.
Yeah. So even the acronym EMDR is kind of a mouthful, but it stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing. So it was originally founded by Francine Shapiro. She was, I think, getting her doctoral degree in psychology, but she had some sort of distressing event happen and took a walk and noticed she was scanning the horizon, so kind of moving her eyes back and forth as she was taking this walk, and realized she felt better afterwards. And then she was like, maybe there's something to this, and ended up researching it. I think she did her dissertation on it, and they found that something about the eye movements, it's what they call bilateral stimulation of the brain. So you're stimulating the left side and then the right side, the left side and then the right side, alternately, which that can be done with eye movements. It can be done with auditory tones, so just tones that alternate in each ear, or what we call tactile buzzers. So there's, little pods that you hold that alternately buzz. And they're not entirely sure why it works, but that re-encodes the traumatic memory in the brain in sort of a healthy adaptive way. So traumatic memories get trapped in the brain differently than a regular memory. That's why we can develop PTSD, right? It's it's kind of frozen in space and time. And so then we have these triggers, right? And the way the EMDR transforms it and re-encodes it, it doesn't get rid of the memory. It's not like Men in Black flashing a little light and you forget everything. But it's you can remember a memory and tell somebody about it the way that I'm talking to you right now, versus having it be this really activating, distressing type thing. And you can they do functional MRIs of the brain, and there are certain parts of the brain that light up that are an indication of trauma. And so they'll do the scan of the brain before EMDR, and these centers are really lit up. And then after a course of EMDR, and clearing a memory to completion where it's no longer distressing, and those parts of the brain, it's barely lit up at all. So we can see from kind of the physiological or neurobiological basis that it's doing something.
It's fascinating. And to have that scientific proof, that evidence that it is having an impact in your brain is phenomenal. So how long are these, like if you have someone that's a client, how long are these sessions, and how often do they have to do them to get to that point?
Yeah. So the sort of best practice when you're doing EMDR is to do 2 sessions a week. For some people, for a lot of people, that's not feasible, like either in terms of time or financially. Sometimes there can also be too much therapy. But EMDR is also a whole arc. So we'll do what we call comprehensive history taking. So like a life events timeline, looking at sort of your family dynamics and these other things that may or may not be related. You know, a lot of times people will come in and be like, I had a car accident. I want to process the car accident. And it's like, okay, yes, we will do that. And what are the themes related to this, right? Like lack of safety, lack of predictability. Are there other things in your past that made this traumatic incident more traumatic, right? Or are there other things that we want to target? Because sometimes people will come in, we process the single incident, and they're still having some of the issues or symptoms of PTSD because there's other stuff connected to it. But so we do the history taking. That usually takes several weeks, and that's twofold. It's for me to get a better clinical picture, but also developing trust and rapport, right? Like if we're going into some deep traumatic material, I want you to be able to trust me. And I want to know more about you and how I can best support you. So there's a whole sort of like phase 1 of the treatment. And then once we get into the actual processing, that's the eye movements, the bilateral stimulation. I mean, it's still a 1-hour therapy session, and we do not process for the entire time. It's usually about 15 minutes. Like there's a built-in check-in at the beginning, see how people are doing. With EMDR, sometimes things get worse before they get better. So, you know, there can be an increase in symptoms, like distressing dreams, that type of thing can be really common. So we'll work through that, do some like grounding and resourcing if necessary, and then get into the processing itself, which has they focus on the memory to start. And then we do a set, quote unquote, which is like 1.5 minutes of the eye movements. And then I'll stop them and ask what's coming up. And we just let what comes up come up. We have this innate capacity for healing. And so once we're in the processing, it's much different for me. Like I'm more of a bystander, just watching the process unfold, and clients get there on their own. I don't have to lead them there. And so EMDR is a lot more effective and efficient than talk therapy. We can do in a few months with EMDR what would probably take years to do in talk therapy. And again, EMDR gets at the root rather than just symptom management. It's like we're getting rid of the symptoms instead of just trying to get through them each day.
Yeah, you're getting to the root of the problem. And how do you figure out if it is the eye movement or you use the tactile or something different? How do you determine that?
It's just people's preference.
Okay.
A lot of people like the tactile or the auditory just because they don't have to have, we call it dual attention stimulus. So essentially you're having to focus on your eyes moving while you're also thinking about the memory and letting the processing happen. So it can feel clunky at first. But when you have the buzzers or the tones in your ear, you don't have to think about it. It's just kind of automatic.
Very interesting. So
Yeah.
are you just thinking through it, or are you talking about it when you're doing all this stuff?
Different therapists do it differently, and it can also depend on the client. I mean, I feel like we say that so much in therapy. It
Sure.
depends. The traditional model is not to have any talking. So it's like we start with the memory, I say go with that, and then the client is silent for the 1.5 minutes. But sometimes it can be helpful to talk through it. Like if people are verbal processors, if the memory feels, if it's really high on the distress scale, sometimes having the talking, there's more engagement with the therapist. So I would say with the majority of my clients, though, it's like being silent and just seeing what comes up. You know, sometimes it will connect back to another memory, or I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that comes up. So we start with the traumatic incident, but by the end of the processing sets, we might be somewhere completely different.
So interesting. And have you done it many times yourself?
So my main experience with it was in the training. We practiced on each other, which was really helpful from obviously like the therapist standpoint, but then also the client standpoint, and being like, oh yeah, this does feel kind of weird, or, you know, just having that perspective. The main thing I focused on was for phobia. I have a pretty severe fear of heights, which, you know, living in Colorado and doing a lot of hikes and all of that gets in the way of some of the outdoorsy things that I want to do. And so I didn't fully get through it. It did connect back to some childhood memories and some stuff that I wasn't expecting. But I noticed even with what I did during the training, my fear of heights has lessened. And I know if I went back, I want to go back someday and like round it out. So to answer your question, yes, I did it a little bit. Not as in-depth, not the whole comprehensive thing like I do with clients.
Wow. So in your mind, you feel like it's something that your sister could have benefited from?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted her to do it.
Yeah.
And I think she even had a consultation with somebody at one point. But again, it was that like back and forth. When she was struggling, she would be like, I want to get better. I want to tackle this stuff. And then, you know, going into denial or fear or whatever it is, and never actually getting the help that I think she needed.
Yeah. Yeah. It's unfortunate that she wasn't able to take advantage of that and utilize what you learn, you know, over time. But I think it's amazing that you're helping other people through their trauma and their issues, using that within your own practice. So tell us a little bit about your practice and where people can find you if they're looking for something that's a little bit different in terms of therapy.
Yeah. So I'm currently licensed in Colorado and Missouri, so I can see clients anywhere in either of those states. My approach is very much what we call depth psychology. So again, looking at like what's underneath everything, not just managing the symptoms. There is a time and a place for that, and I do that with clients. It's like, let's build skills. Let's like help you manage your day-to-day better. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Let's look at what's underneath all of it. And so I use the metaphor of, it's like if you're weeding a garden and you're just pulling out the green parts of the leaves, the plant's going to grow back, the weed's going to grow back. But if we're getting it at the root, then people have more lasting relief. So I work a lot with people who have like been to therapy before, but they're like, it didn't really work, or there were a lot of things I got out of it, but I'm still having these things resurface. I work a lot with trauma. Again, that's such a broad umbrella, but everything from like assaults to veterans to car accidents. I do a lot with like childhood trauma, or what we call negative adverse experiences. And that's an interesting one, because as an adult, we might look back on something as a kid that seems so trivial to our adult brain. You know, when we're like really digging into an issue, I'll have ask a client, what's your earliest memory of another time you felt like this? That's an EMDR technique called a float back. And then they'll float back to this seemingly mundane situation. And they're like, but that was stupid. That was, you know, my mom was a single parent and doing the best she could. And I'm like, absolutely, we can honor that all day long. And like, your 5-year-old self felt abandoned in that moment. And so that's the idea of getting at the core of it.
So can you give us some examples of circumstances or clients that you've had that have maybe come in to see you thinking that they're going to focus on one traumatic event, and then it's turned into something so much bigger or different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's one I'm thinking of. It was like a car accident, and then fear of flying was the presenting problem. And this is where I like doing what I call peeling the onion. It's like getting at the layers underneath it. So it's looking at like, okay, with the fear of flying, how is that connected to the automobile accident, obviously? But like asking, well, so why are you afraid of flying? What's the worst thing that could happen? And it's like, okay, the plane could go down. Okay, what's the worst thing about the plane going down? Well, I would die. Usually we would stop there, right? Like death is the worst thing. But then you ask, what's the worst thing about you dying? And with one client, it was like, well, if I died, my friends and family would have to go into my house and clean it out, and they would realize I was a hoarder. And so fear of flying actually had nothing to do with airplanes or anything. It had to do with fear of judgment. So then looking at, well, where does that fear of judgment stem from? Which we all have to a certain degree in our society. But, then looking at like incidents of bullying as a kid or different experiences like that. So that's where it like fills out, right? And that's why it's so helpful to get the comprehensive history and everything before we just dive into processing.
Very interesting. And I can see where one thing leads to another. And I love that you are you're trying to get to the exact root of the cause, because that's where everything manifests from. And if you don't attack that, you're never going to solve everything that happens, on the outside. So
yeah,
it's pretty fascinating. And do you find that most people have been through traditional therapy and then they try talking to someone like you that has these other non-traditional options?
A lot of times, yes. People will have been to talk therapy, and like I do a lot of talk therapy too. It can be really helpful. But with some of this stuff, and again, sometimes it's not even the modality. It's just like we weren't focusing on the actual issue that's contributing to this. So I have a lot of clients who have been in therapy before, and so they come with a lot of really great tools, which is awesome. And people who haven't been. I do a lot of work with like resourcing and teaching skills and that type of thing, so that we're not just, digging into a trauma and then leaving people raw and wide open. We contain it, we do grounding, and those are just good skills to have as a human too.
Sure. So for someone who doesn't have a lot of experience or background in this, do you, as just a normal person with insurance, are you able to choose this as a therapy before? There's no like step therapy. Can you go, like you were saying, go directly into it if that's something that's interesting to you?
Yeah, you can go directly into it. For people wanting insurance to cover it, if your insurance covers behavioral health, that's usually what they call it in the insurance world, mental health, what have you, EMDR would be covered because it's an evidence-based practice. So your insurance says, yes, I'll pay for therapy. It's kind of at the discernment of the therapist what modality they're using.
Interesting. And so you said it started in the 90s? Or that's when it got popular? Or is that when it started?
That's when it started.
Okay.
I think Francine Shapiro published her first paper maybe in '89. So it's like relatively new, but also like yes and no. The field of psychology is so young compared to so much else when you really think about it. If we think about it starting with Freud, psychology in general, again, hasn't been around that long. But in terms of the evidence-based practices, EMDR is probably up there in terms of being around the longest. The other classic one is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. But yeah, so if it's been around since the 90s, what, 30 something years at this point?
It's young, for sure.
Yeah.
That's great to know it's out there. And we've definitely had other individuals that we've interviewed who have been through traumatic loss. And specifically for those women, a few women we've interviewed, it has had to do with suicide. And when they've come upon their loved one, and that image is just in their brain and they cannot escape from that. So one woman in particular talked about how she's really been able to move through that because of EMDR.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful to hear that there is something that can just, does it fade the memory? You can talk, it fades it a little bit. It's not so sharp, kind of a not so poignant type of a thing.
Yeah. A lot of time when we get to the end of processing, like, because we look at where is the distress level of the memory from 0 to 10. 10 is worst you've ever felt. 0 is no distress at all. We want to get to 0. When we're in those lower numbers, and I tell people at the beginning of a session, okay, go into the memory. 9 times out of 10, they're like, it's really foggy. It seems far away. It's like I'm watching it from above. So again, you don't forget it, but it does, like there's distance from it, I think literally and figuratively in the brain.
Which is so helpful because you don't want that raw emotion to hit over and over and over again because it is re-traumatizing. And
Yeah.
so it sounds like it's an amazing thing that your brain can do if it's done the right way. And it's fascinating that it goes from side to side.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested to see if they continue to publish more information. I'm sure you get updates on research, and you talked about a couple of other resources. One was EMDR, and maybe it was Psychology Today. Is that what it's called?
Yeah. So EMDRIA is the EMDR International Association. So it's emdria.org. That's where you can learn more about EMDR. And then they also have a directory of EMDR therapists. So that's those of us who have done the training, are certified. We have to do continuing education, but it's a whole, I was going to say nationwide directory, but I think it's worldwide. And then Psychology Today is an awesome resource for finding a therapist anywhere. You can filter by insurance, you can filter by modality. So like I want to find an EMDR therapist who takes Cigna in St. Louis or in the state of Missouri. And I tell people, do consultations. Like, it's like interviewing, it's like dating, like seeing who feels like a good fit, because having a good fit is super important. Because if you don't trust me, there's like, that's so important for the container and for the healing to happen.
Absolutely. There's no way you're going to just, spill your guts, so to speak, to someone you don't feel like you can do that with. It's vital. Like you said, it's like dating. It's like something, you have to have that good connection before you're going to take that next step. So that makes total sense. And those are great resources.
Yeah. And the consultations are almost always free. It's usually like a free 20 to 30 minute phone consultation if we feel like we vibe and what I offer aligns with what the client is looking for, then we'll move forward with an intake. But yeah, I tell people do a few consultations at the very least.
And that's great advice, because I know we've had some challenges with one of our sons in certain areas, and you're just referred to people.
Yep.
You get a list and you call, and if they're covered, whatever. But it really is important because you're trusting them with your most, private information, that just your core. And I feel like that's just amazing advice, because you just feel like you're handed a piece of paper and there's no background check, so to speak. You want to make sure that you have that good fit. So
Yeah.
very valuable information. So oftentimes when people go through a traumatic experience and they start their grieving process, they'll go through traditional medicine. So what is your opinion on that route versus more of the therapeutic, natural route?
Yeah. So what I believe is also backed by a lot of scientific evidence, which is that the best outcomes are actually with medication and therapy. And it depends on people's perspective. I mean, I honor medications. I absolutely think there's a time and a place for them, but that it's meant to be stabilization, right? Like, let's get you on this antidepressant or anti-anxiety medication right now, get you into therapy, and then once you've resolved the trauma, once you've developed the skills to manage the anxiety and depression, once you've moved through the phases of grief, then, not to say that there's necessarily an end point to grief, we'll put a pin in that, but then with the eventual goal of getting off the medication. But in our society, we take a pill for everything, you know? And in a lot of ways, that is easier. I get it. Like, therapy is work, right? You have to invest time and effort and be willing to look at yourself and dig up and excavate some things that aren't fun. And so taking a pill is a lot easier. But it only does so much. You know, the metaphor I use for medication, because a lot of times people think it will just completely get rid of all their symptoms. And sometimes it does, like a Xanax, a Klonopin, that's probably going to get rid of your anxiety in that moment. But for like an antidepressant, it's like being in a winter storm. And the antidepressant, we can't control the weather. We can't make the storm go away, but it's giving you a winter coat. It's giving you a hat and gloves so that you can weather the storm more easily.
I love that analogy. It's great. And in full transparency, I've been on anti-anxiety drugs for years. And I feel like when I start getting edgy, because that's, you know, it happens, I'll just take the pill and I feel better. But what's causing that anxiety? I would love to know. I would love to dive deeper. And is it hereditary, or, you know, there's so many different ways to explore it, but it's that quick fix. Like, I know I'm getting jittery or whatever the result is of this anxiety. And you just know you can do that and feel so much better. But it would be so interesting to just solve that problem at the root. So I feel like there is a lot to be learned, even as you age, and, you know, there's still things you can learn and change and fix with the right mentality. So to me, that's very interesting and something I might want to explore in the future.
Yeah.
Now, back to, we talked about grief. And one thing you've said in prior conversations is that grief is not linear in any way, shape, or form. Can you talk to our listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we have the traditional model of, a lot of people are familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. And a lot of therapists don't even really like the term stages, because it makes it seem like it is this linear path. Like, you go through anger, you go through bargaining, you go through depression, you go through acceptance. And you might go through all of those things, you might not. So I like using like phases or states of grief. This is a state of grief you might be in. Some people don't go through bargaining. Some people don't go through anger. And that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. The only quote unquote wrong way to do it is to repress it, right? And try to just ignore it and push it under the rug. But a lot of people, when they experience their first loss, they're like, am I doing this right? I'm crying every day, or I'm not crying at all. And no matter what we're doing, we're judging it, right? So especially for people who are not as emotive, they're like, I haven't shed a single tear. And it's like, it doesn't mean you're not grieving. You might be in shock. You might just be experiencing it on a different level. You might be needing to compartmentalize. Maybe you're somebody who doesn't really cry, but like not judging that. There's a really beautiful book called Grief Soup, and it talks about grief as like a metaphor of you're eating your soup. And so if there's a loss in your family, one person might down their whole bowl of soup all in one day, right? And that might be, you know, you're crying, you can't get out of bed, like you're acutely deep in the grief. Somebody else might eat it like just a little spoonful at a time, which, I mean, that happens for all of us. Grief ebbs and flows. Sometimes you have no idea when it's going to pop up. Other people, they kind of put their grief in the freezer and they're like, I'm going to deal with that another time, or I'm going to deal with it never. Again, understandable. And another thing I tell people, we have all of these sort of cliches or proverbs like time heals all wounds, and time can lessen the wound, but I don't know that it actually heals all of them, right? Like, I think about my parents. Do you ever truly heal from losing a child? I don't think so. And so it's like, yeah, it might scab over, but there's still going to be a scar. And sometimes we're going to bump into that wound and it's going to feel a lot like it did the day that it happened. And so again, the biggest thing is non-judgment. The way that you're grieving is perfect. It's the way that you're supposed to. And the best way to do it is with support.
and I love, so you have so many great analogies, and it's true, because you can get into, you not only judge yourself, but you judge others on how they're grieving. And I've had to, as I've gotten older, be mature in the sense that this person might be completely beside themselves versus I'm less emotional, and being able to balance that and understand that there are different ways to grieve, and you have to be respectful of that, and you can't tell someone how to grieve.
So there is no right or wrong way to grieve. The way that people are grieving is perfect. That's the way that they're meant to. And I just say the best way is through support. And a lot of people come to me saying, I don't know how to help my friend or family member who's in grief. A lot of us feel uncomfortable around it, right? Because it's like, well, I just want you to stop that. And we, a lot of times I think, can be really distant, because it's like, well, I don't know what to do, so I'm just not going to do anything. And so I just say, like, ask, what do you need? And I'll say, if you don't know what you need, that's okay too. I can send you cute animal memes. I can bring you a meal. I can be a shoulder to cry on. We can come over and watch 90s rom-coms. Like, you let me know, and it's okay if that changes day to day or minute to minute.
I love that. That's a great, and I'm going to use that going forward, because, there is that awkwardness of, you don't know how they're assessing this, and you might have a completely different vantage point in way you deal with grief. But I love that you gave all those examples of, these are maybe different ways we can attack this together, and make you more comfortable, but that you're open to any one of those. It's not like one's better than another. So I really appreciate that advice, and I think people should take that to heart and just approach people vulnerably, and let them kind of express how they want to move forward and how you can help them. So is there anything else that you'd like to cover today, or feel like you'd like to share with the listeners with regard to what you're doing, or any other suggestions in getting through some of those traumatic events in life?
Yeah, biggest thing, everyone can benefit from therapy, whether you're currently struggling or not. I'm a big fan of like positive psychology, meaning if we're not triaging crisis, how can we go deeper? If you feel like you're doing pretty well, how can you be an even more like actualized best version of yourself? And if you are in crisis, let's tend to that. People can find me at wildsagecounseling.com. So that's my business, is called Wild Sage Counseling. And if people want to connect with me, they can book a consultation that way, learn more about me. That's the only thing in addition to the EMDR website, and then Psychology Today.
That's great. I love the name. It sounds very ethereal, or like Colorado-based, kind of. You know what I mean? Wilderness, back to the wilderness roots. So a very nice name, and we appreciate all of the incredible information. And I know you've been through a lot, and you've also been on the flip side of helping others. So it's a tremendous progression of your own personal journey, and it means a lot to the people listening and looking for ways to manage their grief and move forward. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to sharing it with our listeners.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for sharing these stories. It means a lot.
You've been listening to Life Beyond Loss, a podcast from Survival in the Trenches. If you'd like to get involved and help those struggling to cope with personal loss, visit us at our website, survivalitt.com, and follow us on social media. Don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast so we can continue to grow and reach more people in need. Together, we can make a difference.